Stay home, the trip is too hard for you. Those were the exact words. No softening, no pause, no glance to see if it pierced me. Just delivered flat, as though my life, my choices, and my longing for this moment had already been neatly boxed and stored away. What made it worse was that I wasn't even at home when they said it. I was sitting in the stiff plastic chair by the boarding gate, the ticket still tucked in my bag, my walking cane resting against my leg. The loudspeaker called out boarding groups as though it didn't matter that my family had decided I wasn't fit to join them. I had dressed carefully that morning, my scarf pressed, my shoes polished. I had rehearsed how I would step onto the plane without help, how I would smile and tell them not to fuss. But none of it mattered. In their eyes, I was already fragile, already behind, already too much to manage. I remember holding my breath in that moment, the way you do when you want the world to stop hearing the sound of your heart breaking. I wanted to respond, to tell them I was fine, that I was already here, already ready. But they had turned their faces toward one another, toward tickets and bags, toward laughter that did not include me. And so I sat still, like a child scolded for dreaming too big. It wasn't anger that rose in me first. It was shame. A kind of hollow ache that made me wonder if they had been right all along, if perhaps I didn't belong in places of adventure anymore, if the gate had always been meant as a border I could no longer cross. The memory of how I had prepared was still fresh. I had packed carefully, rolling my clothes to make room for the travel journal I had saved just for this trip. I had even written the date of departure on the first page, leaving the rest blank in anticipation. I had thought of the stories I would tell when we returned, the sights I would sketch, the small souvenirs I would tuck away to remind me that I had lived not only as mother or grandmother but as a woman who still craved the world. I had not told them how much it meant to me, perhaps because I feared exactly this, that they would measure me against their own impatience and find me wanting. At the gate, the screen shifted to final boarding. My body wanted to rise, to walk forward, to insist that I could take my seat like anyone else. But their voices carried louder than the announcements, circling around me with well-meaning dismissal. It'll be easier if she stays. Less worry. We'll bring her something back. As though I were a parcel that could be managed by exchange. My cane tapped once against the tile, a small sound that nobody turned to hear. When they moved toward the jet bridge, I stayed behind. I tried to swallow the lump in my throat, but tears blurred the sign that read gate closed. I thought of how long I had looked forward to this trip, not even for the destination itself, though it was a place I had always dreamed of. What mattered more was being part of the journey, being included in the rhythm of departure and return, of meals shared in unfamiliar places, of laughter spilling into hotel corridors. Instead, I was left with silence, the echo of suitcase wheels pulling away, the hollow clatter of my own cane when I finally stood to leave. On the ride home, the city outside the window blurred into one long smear of color. I didn't want the driver to see my tears, so I turned my face toward the glass, pretending to watch the traffic. My bag, still heavy with carefully packed clothes, pressed against my lap like a cruel reminder. I kept replaying the words in my head, "Stay home." Each time, they carried a new sting. Sometimes they sounded like care, like worry. Sometimes they sounded like command. And sometimes they sounded like truth, and that was the hardest to bear. That evening, when I unlocked my front door, the quiet of the house wrapped itself around me. I set my bag on the floor but didn't unpack. The scarf I had chosen for the trip was still looped around my neck. I reached up to touch its edge, feeling the texture of the fabric, and I told myself to breathe. I boiled water for tea, more out of habit than need, and sat at the kitchen table while the steam curled upward. The empty chair across from me seemed to mock the one I had left empty at the gate. I wanted to be angry at them, at my family, but I knew that anger would corrode me from within. And yet, forgiveness felt too generous, too soon. I stayed in that middle place, where hurt lingers without name. As night fell, I pulled the journal from my bag. I stared at the first page, the date already written in my neat handwriting. I wanted to cross it out, to tear it away, but instead I pressed my pen to the paper. My hand trembled at first, but then the words came, spilling in a way they never had before. I wrote not of sights I had missed, but of the moment at the gate, of the way silence can feel like abandonment, of the small humiliations that arrive not with strangers but with those you love most. I wrote until my hand ached, until the tea beside me had gone cold. And when I stopped, I felt something stir inside me, not comfort, not resolution, but a seed of defiance. If they would not carry me into the world, then I would find a way to carry myself. The next morning, I woke to sunlight pressing against the curtains, the kind of light that insists you get up even when your heart begs to stay down. My bag was still on the floor by the door, half slumped, as if it too had been abandoned. I thought of unpacking, but the thought of folding those clothes back into drawers felt like admitting defeat. So I left it there. I boiled water for tea again, watching the kettle hum, and in the silence I realized something: I had no one to call. My family had already boarded their flight, perhaps already in the air, perhaps already laughing about the snacks, about the seats, about anything but me. And I, left behind, was supposed to carry on as though nothing had happened. The strangeness of being excluded is that it makes the ordinary world feel hostile. Even the sound of the mail slot clicking startled me, as though the house were reminding me that life would continue regardless of whether I kept pace. I picked up the envelopes, but my eyes didn't focus on the words. Bills, advertisements, the same hollow paper trail as always. I set them aside and sat again with the journal. The page from the night before still bore the weight of my pen strokes, heavy enough to dent the paper beneath. I traced them with my finger, and I thought, if I cannot journey outward, then perhaps I must journey inward. So I wrote. I wrote about the scarf I had chosen and how it now felt like a costume left behind after the performance was cancelled. I wrote about the faces of the people at the gate who did not notice the small drama unraveling beside them. I wrote about the way exclusion does not arrive with shouting or violence, but with polite phrases meant to sound protective. Stay home. It's too hard for you. Those words are a net woven of pity, and once cast, it takes strength to cut yourself free. I had not cut free. Not yet. But writing gave me a knife, if only a small one. By midday, the quiet became unbearable. I decided to walk to the park, something I hadn't done in weeks. I slipped on my shoes and took my cane, each step a reminder of the body they judged incapable. The air smelled faintly of earth and grass, and in the distance, children's voices carried like birdsong. I sat on a bench near the pond and watched the ducks glide, their calm movements at odds with the storm inside me. No one around me knew that I was supposed to be elsewhere, that I had been deemed too weak to sit on a plane seat like any other passenger. To them, I was simply another older woman resting on a bench. That anonymity was both a comfort and a wound. A woman near my age sat down beside me, adjusting her sun hat. She smiled politely, and I returned the gesture. After a moment, she sighed. My daughter says I shouldn't come here alone anymore. She worries I'll fall. She chuckled softly, though it was not humor but resignation in her voice. But I told her, if I fall, I fall. At least I'll fall where the ducks can laugh at me. Her words loosened something in me. I smiled more genuinely this time and replied, at least they'd be kinder witnesses than our children. We shared a look, a quiet acknowledgement that we were not alone in being underestimated. It didn't last long, she left soon after, her steps slow but steady, yet the encounter stayed with me. If she could choose defiance, perhaps so could I. That night, I cooked myself a meal with more care than usual. Nothing extravagant, just roasted vegetables and rice, but I set the table properly, with a cloth napkin and a glass of water poured as though I were expecting company. I sat, ate slowly, and reminded myself that I did not need others to validate my presence at the table. Each bite tasted both bitter and sweet, for independence is flavored with both pride and loneliness. The days stretched. I marked them in my journal, not with laments but with observations. The neighbor's cat stretched across my garden wall. The postman wore a new cap. The wind carried the scent of rain before the first drops fell. Small things, but each proof that I was still attentive, still alive, still participating in the world, even if my family had relegated me to the margins. Yet beneath these notes ran a current of determination. I began writing not only what I saw, but what I intended. One line grew into a refrain: I will not be left behind again. When their first message arrived, a photograph sent from their destination, I stared at it longer than I should have. They stood together against a backdrop I had longed to see. Their smiles were broad, their clothes casual. My absence was not visible, not in the frame, not in their posture. They had arranged themselves into a complete picture without me. I did not reply. I set the phone aside and returned to my writing. But later, when I lay in bed, I whispered to the dark, "You will not erase me." The house felt emptier with every day of their trip, as though their laughter had left an echo that I could not silence. Yet in that emptiness, I also found space to hear my own thoughts more clearly. I began to ask myself, when had I stopped demanding inclusion? When had I allowed myself to be treated as fragile glass instead of living flesh? Perhaps it was not only their dismissal that hurt, but my own complicity. I had smiled too often, agreed too quickly, swallowed my protests before they left my lips. I had mistaken silence for peace, when in truth it was only surrender. One afternoon, I walked to the library. The air smelled of paper and dust, the comforting scent of a place where words outlast bodies. I wandered through the aisles until I found the travel section. My hand brushed across the spines of books that promised distant lands. I pulled one down, a worn guide to a country I had always dreamed of but never visited. I carried it to a table and opened it slowly, as though unwrapping a gift. The pages were filled with maps, photographs, suggestions for travelers. I lingered on each image, imagining myself there. And then, in the quiet of the library, I made a decision. I would plan my own journey. Perhaps not tomorrow, perhaps not next week, but soon. Not with their permission, not with their company, but with my own will. I would prove, if only to myself, that I was not done moving through the world. That night, I wrote it plainly: they told me to stay home. Next time, I will not ask. When they finally returned from their trip, it was not the dramatic reunion I had once imagined. They breezed into my living room with the lightness of people who had not considered the weight they had left behind. Their voices filled the space with stories of meals, sights, inconveniences turned into anecdotes. I sat in my armchair and listened, nodding where expected, smiling in places I did not feel. They handed me a souvenir, a keychain in the shape of a monument I had longed to see with my own eyes. "So you can feel like you were there," one of them said, as though a trinket could carry the scent of air or the ache of standing before something vast and real. I turned it in my hand, its metal edges sharp against my skin, and thanked them quietly. They did not notice how my fingers stiffened around it. It was in that moment, as their voices tumbled over one another and my silence remained unremarked, that something in me hardened. Not in bitterness, though bitterness tempted me, but in resolve. I realized I had been waiting for their validation, their permission, their inclusion, as though my life were a seat at their table. That night, after they left and the house sank back into quiet, I placed the keychain on the table beside my journal and the blue scarf I had bought at the seaside. One symbol of dismissal. One symbol of defiance. They looked at each other across the wood like opponents, and I knew which one would win. In the days that followed, I began to plan. Not loudly, not with fanfare. Planning in silence became its own kind of rebellion. I opened my laptop and searched flights to places within reach, not the impossible dream of foreign coasts yet, but cities I could step into on my own terms. I read timetables for trains, checked hotel reviews that spoke of accessibility and kindness. I told no one. To speak too soon would invite their doubts, their warnings, their careful nets of concern. I had learned how easily those nets could tangle me. So I wove my own instead, threads of intention knotted quietly into shape. My first act was small, a bus to the next town, alone. I dressed as though it mattered, not because anyone would see but because I wanted to feel the texture of preparation again. My cane clicked steadily on the pavement as I approached the stop. Others waited, young and impatient, middle-aged and distracted, none of them aware of the small revolution standing beside them. When the bus pulled up, I stepped forward first. The driver glanced at me, his eyes briefly flicking to the cane. "Take your time," he said, and for once, instead of hearing pity, I chose to hear respect. I climbed, found a seat, and breathed. The journey was not long, but it was enough. Enough to remind me that the world did not vanish when I traveled alone, that I was not erased by the absence of company. The town itself was unremarkable, shops in a row, a small square, pigeons pecking at crumbs. But I walked through it with the curiosity of a woman reclaiming territory. I stopped at a bakery and bought a roll, warm in my hand, its crust flaking onto my lap as I sat on a bench. I wrote about it in my journal later that day, not because it was extraordinary, but because it was mine. Gradually, my steps grew bolder. The library again, but this time not to borrow a guidebook for dreaming. I asked the librarian about travel memoirs, stories of people who had set out later in life. She brought me 3, her smile conspiratorial as though she sensed my secret. I read them slowly, savoring not the destinations but the decisions. Each page reminded me that courage is rarely a roar, more often it is the quiet turning of a doorknob, the soft click of a suitcase latch. Then one evening, I returned to the sea. Not with my family, not with their approval, but with my own intention. I booked the train without hesitation this time, packed my bag with more confidence, tied the blue scarf at my throat like armor. The pier was waiting, the gulls loud and unapologetic. I walked farther along than before, past the place where I had stumbled. My steps were slower, yes, but steady. At the very end, I stood with the wind pushing against me and I whispered aloud, "I am here." No one heard. It did not matter. I heard. Back home, the postcard I had once sent to myself still stood on the mantel, its edges curling slightly with time. I looked at it and felt something shift. It was no longer proof of a single outing, it had become a promise. A reminder that I had begun a journey not measured in miles but in resolve. And for the first time in many weeks, I smiled without forcing it. I knew then that the next step would not be a seaside town or a bus ride. It would be something larger, something that demanded more of me than hesitation and small victories. It would be the trip they had denied me, or one very much like it, and this time I would not be left behind. It began with shoes. Not new clothes, not a suitcase, not even a ticket, but shoes. My old ones, comfortable as they were, had become worn at the edges, their soles thinning like excuses I had grown tired of making. So I walked into the shoe store one afternoon, past the glossy displays meant for younger feet, and asked the clerk for something steady but not heavy. She measured me, her tape smooth against my ankle, her eyes never dipping into pity. When she brought me a pair, practical, yes, but lined with a quiet elegance, I slipped them on and felt an unfamiliar firmness beneath me. The cane clicked against the floor as I walked a small circuit, and for the first time in a long while, the sound matched my pace instead of dragging behind it. I bought the shoes, carried them home, and left them by the door. Every time I glanced at them, I saw not footwear but intention. From there, other preparations followed, though I told no one. I dusted off my old suitcase, the one that had sat hunched in the corner of the closet as if sulking at its own disuse. Its handle still slid up with a satisfying click. I unzipped it, pressed my palm against the lining, and felt a pang, a mix of sorrow for journeys missed and hunger for those ahead. I aired it out, wiped it clean, and set it beside the new shoes. Together they looked like a sentence in the making. I visited the doctor, too, though not for reassurance. I wanted clarity. I wanted to hear from a professional what my body could and could not do, rather than accept the vague assumptions of those who loved me but underestimated me. She listened carefully, pressed her stethoscope against my back, asked me to rise, to bend, to breathe. "You're slower, yes," she said at last, "but slower is not weaker. Slower simply means you take the world in differently." I left her office with no prescription but a quiet benediction, "Go, at your own rhythm." Evenings became my time of research. I sat at the kitchen table with the laptop glowing before me, comparing train schedules, studying airport maps, reading forums where strangers offered tips for navigating new places with canes or slower steps. Their words steadied me more than they knew. I bookmarked hotels with elevators, cafes near bus stops, museums with benches tucked into quiet corners. My journal filled with lists, not of grievances now but of possibilities. Each page felt like laying another stone across a river I had once believed uncrossable. One night, as I was drafting a tentative itinerary, my phone buzzed with a message from my eldest. Thinking of taking another trip in spring. Somewhere warm. You'd probably find it tiring, but we'll bring you something. I stared at the screen, the familiar sting rising again, and then I set the phone aside. I did not reply. For once, I did not feel the urge to defend myself, to argue, to plead. Their dismissal no longer defined me, it only confirmed what I already knew. They could travel as they wished. I would, too. When I finally booked the flight, it was not with trembling hands but with a steady click of the mouse. The confirmation email arrived, subject line bold and unapologetic, "Your journey is confirmed." I sat back, let the words sink in, and exhaled. I had no need to announce it, no need to ask for approval. The act itself was enough. For years, I had equated independence with grand gestures, but I was learning it was built instead from quiet, consistent defiance, the kind that doesn't shout but still carries far. In the days leading up to departure, I practiced in small ways. I took longer walks, testing the shoes until they molded to my steps. I carried a bag heavier than usual to reacquaint my shoulders with weight. I rehearsed moving through the house with efficiency so that the rhythm of packing and preparing would not feel foreign. I even walked to the bus stop during the busiest part of the day, just to practice weaving through crowds without apology. Each exercise was a conversation with myself. Yes, you can. Yes, you belong. Yes, you are going. The night before the flight, I packed deliberately. Not just clothes, but symbols. The blue silk scarf from the seaside, folded carefully at the top. The postcard I had once mailed to myself, slipped into the journal as a bookmark. Even the keychain, though it pained me, I tucked into a side pocket, not as a memento of exclusion but as proof of what I had risen from. These objects were my companions, talismans of a journey already begun before I ever reached the airport. When morning came, I tied the scarf loosely at my throat, shouldered the suitcase, and locked the door. This time, I did look back, not in hesitation, but in acknowledgement. The house had been my cocoon, my witness, my refuge. But it could not travel for me. Only I could. The taxi ride to the airport was a blur of gray streets and quiet anticipation. I watched the driver's hands on the wheel, steady and unhurried, and thought of my own hands, how they had trembled once at the gate, how they now rested calm on the handle of my cane. When the terminal doors slid open, I stepped inside with a deep breath. The air smelled of coffee, metal, and motion. Screens flickered with destinations. Announcements echoed. This time, I was not sitting at the gate waiting for permission to exist. I was here to claim my passage. The first test was the security line. I had dreaded it more than the flight itself, the shuffle forward, the trays to fill, the hurried pace that seems to punish anyone who dares to move with deliberation. My cane clattered as I placed it in the bin, and for a moment, my breath caught. But the officer on the other side gestured kindly, guiding me through with patience that felt rare in such a place. I collected my things, tied the scarf back around my neck, and stood taller. One step completed. At the gate, I sat in the same kind of plastic chair where I had once been dismissed, but this time my name was on the boarding pass in my hand. No one was telling me to stay behind. I traced the raised letters of my destination with my thumb and thought of the journal waiting in my bag. When boarding was called, I rose, steadied myself, and walked forward. No hesitation. No voices trying to stop me. The jet bridge hummed underfoot, and I let it carry me toward a new chapter. The seat itself was narrow, the kind that makes you aware of every bone and angle. But as the engines roared and the plane tilted upward, I felt something I hadn't in years, flight within and without. My stomach dipped, my ears popped, and the ground fell away. I pressed my forehead lightly to the window and whispered, "You are doing this." The clouds spread like fields below, endless and indifferent. For once, their indifference felt like freedom. Arrival was its own test. The foreign airport was louder, brighter, full of languages I couldn't grasp. Signs pointed in every direction, and people rushed as though time itself were running out. I slowed myself deliberately. Step, breath, cane, suitcase. At first the noise threatened to swallow me. Then I remembered the postcard I had written to myself months earlier. You were here. You stood. You did not turn back. I repeated it in my head until the panic eased into rhythm. I found the taxi queue and gave the driver the name of my hotel, rehearsed carefully in my mouth before speaking. He nodded, and we drove through streets alive with honking horns, flashing lights, and buildings that seemed to lean closer to one another than at home. I rolled down the window an inch to taste the air. It carried spices I could not name, heat that clung to the skin, and a hum of voices that made me feel small in the best possible way. The hotel lobby smelled of polished wood and citrus. The receptionist smiled, asked if I had traveled far, and when I said yes, she did not ask for anyone else's name, only mine. My room was simple but neat, with a window that overlooked a courtyard where children played football, their laughter bouncing off the walls like a song. I placed the scarf on the back of the chair, the keychain on the desk, the journal on the nightstand. For the first time in years, I unpacked not because I was staying with family but because I had chosen a place entirely my own. The next morning, I woke before dawn. Jet lag, perhaps, but also anticipation. I dressed slowly, laced my new shoes, and set out. The streets were already alive with vendors setting up stalls, their hands quick and practiced. The scent of frying bread and brewed coffee curled through the air. I stopped at a cart, pointed at something golden and steaming, and handed over a coin. The vendor wrapped it in paper, and I bit into it while walking. The taste was unfamiliar, sweet, spiced, greasy in a way that clung to my lips. It was perfect. I laughed softly to myself, alone in a crowd, and felt younger than I had in years. The day unfolded like a lesson in persistence. Stairs where I hadn't expected them, crowds that pressed too close, moments when my legs ached and my hand gripped the cane tighter. But each challenge passed, and with each passing, my confidence grew. I visited a museum, lingering on benches, letting the paintings speak to me in colors rather than words. I wandered into a market, bought a scarf for no reason other than its texture reminded me of water. I wrote in my journal at a cafe, the hum of foreign conversations wrapping around me like music. There were setbacks, of course. I stumbled once on an uneven curb, catching myself against a wall while a stranger paused to steady me. My pride bristled, but I forced myself to smile and nod. Help accepted is not weakness, I told myself, it is part of belonging to the world. Later, when the fatigue pressed too heavily, I returned to the hotel earlier than planned. I lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling fan whirring above me, and let the tiredness wash through. It was not defeat. It was proof of effort. By the third day, I no longer measured success by distance. I measured it by presence. Sitting in a plaza with pigeons fluttering at my feet. Ordering tea without fumbling the words. Watching the sun set behind buildings older than the family who had told me to stay home. Each moment layered upon the last, forming a mosaic of belonging that no dismissal could ever undo. One evening, I walked to the river that cut through the city. The water reflected neon signs and the glow of lanterns strung along the bank. I stood there for a long time, leaning on my cane, feeling the pulse of the city in the current. And I realized something, I was not proving anything to them anymore. Not to my children, not to those who had excluded me, not even to the strangers who glanced at my cane and made their silent assumptions. I was proving something only to myself, that my life was still mine to step into, one deliberate pace at a time. When I returned to my hotel room that night, I wrote until my hand ached. I wrote of the bread, the river, the laughter in the courtyard, the stumble, the pride, the ache, the triumph. And then I wrote one final line before closing the book, I was not left behind. I walked forward. Coming home felt different this time. The taxi rolled down familiar streets, but I did not feel like the same woman who had left them behind. My suitcase sat beside me, lighter than when I had packed it, though I knew I had returned with far more than I had carried out. The houses lined up in their quiet sameness, windows glowing with ordinary evenings, yet I sat with my scarf around my shoulders and the taste of another city still on my tongue. When the car stopped at my door, I paid the driver and stood with my cane steady. The air smelled of damp earth and wood smoke, but I no longer mistook this for limitation. It was simply home, one place among many. Inside, the silence greeted me. For years, that silence had been heavy, but now it was gentle, like a pause between verses of a song. I unpacked slowly, setting each item on the table with care. A new scarf, dyed the color of river water. A folded flyer from the museum. A slip of paper with a cafe's name scrawled in hurried handwriting. Each was small, but together they formed a map of presence, proof that I had stepped into the world and left traces, however faint. The journal was nearly full. I flipped through the pages and saw not just words but a record of transformation. At first, heavy lines pressed with anger, sentences short and bitter. Later, descriptions of benches, markets, meals. Then, in the most recent pages, the writing had loosened. I had written in longer strokes, less about what was denied me and more about what I had touched, smelled, tasted. I had moved, slowly, from protest to life. My family called 2 days later. They wanted to arrange a dinner, to share photographs, to bring me into the afterstory of their trip. I listened quietly and agreed to the date, but I did not tell them where I had been. Not yet. Some experiences are too sacred to hand over like currency, especially to those who once discounted the value of your presence. Instead, I let the secret rest in me, like a flame I could tend privately. When they arrived, they carried the weightless chatter of people who believe the world bends to their pace. They laid out their souvenirs, their stories, their inconveniences turned comic. I smiled, poured tea, listened. But when one of them finally asked, "So, what have you been doing while we were away?" I only said, "I've kept busy." My tone must have been different, because they paused. But then the conversation shifted, and my answer became just another stone in the river of their words. That was fine. I did not need them to see me. I had seen myself. Later, when the house was quiet again, I opened the drawer and placed their gift, the keychain, next to the scarf from my journey. Not as an insult, but as a contrast. One symbol of being excluded. One of walking forward. They would remain side by side, not to torment me, but to remind me how far I had come. In the weeks that followed, I felt a new rhythm. My errands became less about necessity and more about exploration. I walked to new streets, sat in unfamiliar cafes, asked strangers for directions even when I already knew the way, just to practice the art of speaking, of reaching. The cane tapped like a metronome, keeping pace with the music of a life expanding. One morning, I took the bus to the park where I had once met the woman who spoke of falling among the ducks. She was there again, sitting on the same bench, her sun hat tilted low. I sat beside her, and when she turned with recognition, we exchanged the kind of smile that belongs to conspirators. We talked, not long, not deeply, but enough. She told me she had tripped last week and scraped her knee. But, she said, lifting her chin, I still come. I nodded. So do I answered. We sat in silence then, watching the ducks glide. Two women who refused to vanish, breathing the same air of stubbornness and grace. As winter approached, I found myself at the travel agent's office. Not because I couldn't book things online, but because I wanted the ritual, the maps on the walls, the brochures found on the counter, the human exchange of handing over a card and receiving confirmation. The young man behind the desk asked where I wanted to go. I paused. Then I told him the name of the place my family had once visited without me, the destination where I had been denied. His eyebrows rose, and he asked if I would be traveling alone. Yes, I said simply. There was no tremor in my voice. He tapped at his keyboard, printed the details, slid them across to me. As I signed, I felt as though I were writing more than my name, I was inscribing myself back into the story I had been written out of. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table with the papers spread before me. The confirmation glowed under the lamp. I touched the page, and instead of imagining the obstacles, I saw the possibilities. I was not naive. I knew the journey would be difficult at times, that my body would protest, that there would be moments of loneliness. But I also knew the sweetness of standing at a river, of tasting bread warm from an unfamiliar griddle, of hearing laughter in a courtyard not my own. Difficulty did not erase those things. Difficulty made them shine brighter. Before bed, I stood at the window. The night was still, the air cold. I thought of the words that had begun all of this: stay home. The trip is too hard for you. They no longer cut the same way. They had been a wound, yes, but also a threshold. Without them, I might never have walked to the park, never mailed myself a postcard, never stood at the end of a pier with the sea pressing against me, never boarded a plane with nothing but my own resolve. Their dismissal had tried to shrink me, but instead it had forced me to expand. I untied the blue silk scarf from the chair and looped it around my neck. The fabric was cool, soft, alive against my skin. I caught my reflection in the darkened glass of the window. Not younger, not unchanged, but steadier. A woman who had been told to stay home, and who had gone anyway. I whispered, softly, so only I could hear, I am still going. And in that moment, I knew the gate, once a place of rejection, had become something else entirely. It was not the end. It was the threshold to everything I had yet to claim.